continuing our discussion about psulim in kahuna. We have a case of a katan. This is on page Lamed. And the issue of a katan, as far as avodas hakarbonos, is based on the fact that the Torah, when it describes the Kohanim, describes it as ish. And a katan is excluded whenever the Torah says ish below katan. Now, once he becomes bar mitzvah, technically, with his bar mitzvah, the Kohen is called ish, and he's kosher avodah. However, the Gemara tells us, and the Rambam actually codifies this, halacha, in Ilchos Klei Mikdash, that lo hayu menichim hakohanim ha'achim lavod b'mikdash ad sheyeh ben esrim shana. I'm not sure what that means, other than the literal translation, but the lumdus of it, I don't understand. That the Kohanim could prevent a particular Kohen who, according to the Torah law, qualifies to do the avodah, they can object. And they can say it's like an insult to the avodah to let this young man, this adolescent teenager, to do the avodah. We block him from doing the avodah. A similar halacha, perhaps, applies to Kohen Gadol. And the Achim HaKohanim have to empathize, or they have to have a certain sympathetic view towards Ploni Almoni being chosen as the Kohen Gadol. So there's certain chumras that the Kohanim accepted upon themselves, and they made an absolute rule. Anyone younger than the age of 20 is not going to do the avodah. He's not mature. He hasn't developed. The Torah says, ben esrim li onshim. Well, again, what that means we have to analyze, but that's not for now. And we move on to another category here, which is doraisa. And that is a chalal. Chalal means a child that was born to the father as a Kohen, but the father had married a woman who's illegitimate in the marriage to a Kohen. A Kohen is enjoined from marrying, for example, a grusha, a zona, a chalola. If he goes ahead, he marries any of the above, violating the law, he desecrates his kahuna, and his child is considered a chalal. A chalal is a Kohen genetically, but yet he is excluded and he's disqualified for any avodah because he's a chalal. You know, the thought occurs to me, since I see Don here. Don, if you're in touch with Rav Nachman Kahana, I would like to ask you if in his research, he can differentiate between the genes of a Kohen kosher and a Kohen chalal. If he says, what?
I can ask him. I don't know if it's that sophisticated.
If he would say yes, that I can tell in the genetic structure that this man is a chalal, he's born genetically from Kohen, I would be absolutely flabbergasted.
No, they do have that. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. They do. They do test for the DNA gene of a Kohen. That they do.
No, that I know, but can they differentiate between two Kohanim?
I know.
Both have had the genes of a Kohen, and one is the product of a marriage between a Kohen and a grusha. That I would be flabbergasted.
Yeah, I would be flabbergasted also.
In other words, it would seem to me that a cholol is not genealogical, even though, again, it has to do with the marriage. Rather, it's halachic, it's purely legal. Okay, that's just on the side. He says, Kohen shebal isha asura lo min haTorah. If a Kohen has a relationship with a woman who is prohibited to him, avlad mikra cholol, v'eno oved b'migdash. A cholol is not allowed to do the avodah. We won't allow him to do the avodah. What happens if he did the avodah? But we're going to ask even a more profound question. What happened if he started the avodah? He hasn't completed it yet. We know he's a cholol. Avodaso kshera shenemar. This we derive from a pasuk at the end of Sefer Dvarim. Barech Hashem chelo ufaal yadav tirtzeh. The word chelo, which literally al pi pshuto shel mikra means his power, his might, is interpreted al pi Torah shebal peh as a cholol. Chelo, since it has the three letters ches, lamed, and now we could add another lamed, is a reference to a cholol, uberech, and the Torah says that the product, so to speak, the productivity of a cholol is blessed. And then the Torah says, poel yadav, what he achieves, tirtzeh, has a ritzah. There will be a ritzah karma, even though the avodah was done by a cholol. And afilu chulin shabo, meaning a person who's a cholol, tirtzeh, there's ritzah of the karma. And he tells you to look in the Rambam, Ilchas Bias Migdash, Perek Vav, Halacha Yud. So I don't know, John, if you have the opportunity to open up the Rambam. I won't be able to do that right now because I have, a curriculum that I want to cover. But I'd love to see the Rambam because, and again, it's Perek Vav Halacha Yud 6:10, because I have a feeling that this halacha applies even before the cholol has completed the avodah. Once he began the avodah, we're going to allow him to complete the avodah.
It's Bias Mikdash?
Bias Migdash, yeah. Perek Vav Halacha Yud. You may have to look one halacha before that, one halacha after that. See what you can find. Because as I remember it from my youth, the halacha of a cholol applies even before he completes his avodah, once he began the avodah. We're not going to chepa with him. We're not going to interrupt and terminate his avodah that he began. But I don't know if that's correct. We'll see if the Rambam mentions. Okay. Now, what's the status of the Kohen himself? It's very paradoxical because we're saying that he married a grusha or a zona or a chalola, and his child becomes desecrated, so to speak, becomes mechulo from kedushas kahuna. What about him? I mean, the child's not at fault. He's the criminal. I mean, does he go away scot-free? Can we allow a Kohen who's married to a grusha to do the avodah? Kohen shahayanose noshin ba'avera eino oved. We're not going to allow him to do the avodah. Yediru bezdin al das rabin. Bezdin is going to put him into a kind of exclusion and almost an excommunication. And here Bezdin is representing the entire community. Yidei shelo tia lo hafara shelo Yosef lachta. Normally a neder or a nidur can be revoked. That's called hafaras nidori. But a neder al das rabin, when it's a neder that's taken by the entire community, it's an absolutely binding neder that cannot be voided. There's no hafara for a neder al das rabin. So we're going to make sure that as long as this Kohen remains married to a grusha, he is excluded by virtue of the decree of the Bezdin, Yadiru Bezdin. No one can be made for that until he divorces his wife. The Avad, however, his status is identical with that of a chalal, where we said that a chalal is not allowed to do the avodah, but avodasa kshera. So too the Kohen who's married to a grusha, b'di'eved, his avodah is kshera. And this too you'll find in the same chapter in Bias Mikdash in the Rambam Perek Vav, but go back on halacha to halacha tes. We're looking at halacha yud. And Rabbosai, the implication of this halacha l'maisa today is with regard to Birchas Kohen. Can a Kohen who's married to a grusha be allowed to duchen in shul? Very difficult issue in contemporary life, because we want to be makarev everyone. Man comes in and he says, I'm a Kohen, I want to duchen. He's not allowed to duchen. He's married to a grusha. Very difficult situation. I remember in Boston, there was such a case, and I think the Kohen, there I think it was more an extreme case. He was married out of the faith, and he sued the shul because the shul didn't want to allow him to serve as a Kohen, and they were excluding him. I think they even wanted to exclude him from membership in the shul because he was married out of the faith.
He sued in a bet din, presumably, right?
In a Beit Din, right?
In a bet din, yeah. Do you remember?
No. Oh, you're asking me in that case in Boston?
Yeah.
No. He was suing in a secular, in a non-Jewish court. He
Really?
felt that this was what's the word? Not persecution. What's discrimination? That this was a violation of the laws that guarantee that we're not allowed to discriminate. He was discriminated against because he married a Gentile woman.
Uh-huh.
Again, I don't remember any of the details, so don't ask. I can try to research it for you if you're curious. It was a big Chil Hashem. It was on the front page of the papers.
How about a Kohen who's a homosexual?
Same issue. Are we violating the law of the land by discriminating against the homosexual? Very difficult issue.
But I'm saying halakhically, a Kohen who's a homosexual would not be allowed to duchen if they knew he was a homosexual. Would that be correct?
Well, we spoke about avodah zarah. We spoke about a Kohen who was guilty of avodah zarah. I'm not sure. Now we're speaking about a Kohen who's married to a woman he's not allowed to be married to. Now you're asking a general question,
okay,
which touches on the issue of what's called a mumar. You've heard of a mumar. A mumar is someone who deliberately violates the Torah over and over again.
Okay.
Don, did you find anything there in the Rambam? Eric, Vav, Halacha Yud.
Halacha Yud. Kohen she'ovad v'nivdak v'ninsa cholol avodaso keshera.
So wait a second. Slow down, John. So what happened?
Kohen
He
she'ovad.
did the avodah already.
Yeah.
And then they checked him out and they found out he's a chol.
Yes.
That's not my case. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Avodah kshera.
Yeah. Ve'enov oved lehabot, but he can't continue. V'im ovad lo chilel. Shenemar Baruch Hashem chelo u'fo yadov tirtza. Afilu chulin shebo tirtza.
That's it. So the Rambam doesn't have my case. What happens if he started the avodah? Should we stop him midway? Okay. Next. Now we're coming a little bit closer to Don's question about the homosexual. Now we're talking about a Kohen who deliberately is mitame l'meis. He's got total zilzul and he goes into cemeteries and so forth and so on. Also, once again, we're going to hold him back from doing the avodah. And I'm assuming that Bezdin will get involved here. Achi kabel all of Disney Bezdin, or he mentions Bezdin, shelo yitame. He has to do tshuva, commit himself publicly in front of a court that he will never again go into a cemetery. Im avad avodaso ksheira. Once again, even though we will not allow him, at this point, he hasn't done tshuva yet. He's mezalzel and he's mechalel his kedusha by going into a cemetery. B'diavad, if he did the avodah, his avodah is ksher. Interesting. We have to add an obvious clause here. We know he's not tamei now. If he's tamei now, obviously, we go back to case of a tful yom, which we said, or even a tamei. But we're talking about a person who's known to have a past history of going into a Beis HaKfaros. He's a Kohen, and he's flippant about the laws of Kahuna and Kedushas Kahuna, but nevertheless, right now he's a Tar. Again, how do we know he's Tar? I don't know. Maybe we have to testify that he went to the mikveh, or the time of the Mechatos, he had the sprinkling and so forth and so on, and therefore his avodah b'diavad is ksher. However, l'chatchila, we're going to need him to show up in front of a bezdin and make a declaration and a proclamation that he henceforth will be careful and not be mitame l'meis. Now we go on. We spoke about a tful yom, which means he was tamei, the Kohen, and he went to the mikveh. Everything is set in place for becoming Torah, except for one piece of the puzzle, and that's Hariv Shemsh. The sun is not set. He's only fully Torah tomorrow. Today's a tful yom, and his avodah is psula, mechuleles, and he's chayav misa. So Kohen shenitma, poseli avodat shitoyer, the afli achar shetoval. He went into the mikveh poseli avoda ad sheyariv shemshel. Kohen shenitma betumas mes. The ovad. Now, why should tumas mes be different? We said that a Kohen tamei, if ovar, the ovad is machal avodosa. Do we know why tamei mes should be an exception? Kohen shenitma betumas mes, the ovad, the carbon yachid. Okay, we'll have to see what's been in a carbon seed. What about a carbon yachid? Is nechleku Tanoim, this is Sugin Tzvachim Chav Beis, a machlokas Tanoim im avodaso kshera b'diavad. Not sure why tumas mes should be different. La'alocha avodaso psula. That's why we saw earlier on the previous page that a tamei, any tamei, his avodas mechuleles, because we're going to paskin like that Tana that even in the case of tumas mes, avodaso psula. But there's one Tana who says that in the case of tumas mes, b'diavad avodaso kshera. Yesh mishakasav she'af l'shitas hasover avodaso kshera mikol makom chayav mitzvah kechol tamei she'omar. So the exception to the rule, according to that Tana, in the case of Tamei Mes is only as far as the kashrus of the carbon. But for everything else, in terms of the severity of the violation of the Issa for the Kohen who's Tamei to do the Avodah, there's no difference, even according to that Tana, between a Tamei Mes and any other Tamei. He's Chayav Misa B'nei Shamayim. So the Kula, the leniency in the case of Tamei Mes, according to that Tana, is only vis-a-vis the kashrus of the carbon, but not vis-a-vis the violation. We discussed at great length yesterday that there are two dinim here that sort of overlap, but they should be differentiated. One is the issue of the violation and the punishment thereof. And the other issue, the other dimension, is the status of the carbon if b'diavad he did the avodah. And we had cases where the avodah is psula, but he didn't violate the law. And now we have a case where his avodah kshera, but he did violate the law. And even though he was tamei, tumas mes, and according to this Tana, his avodah b'diavad is kshera, nevertheless it's chayav misim beit shamayim like any other tamei. Now we get to the discussion about a Kohen who served in the Beis Hamikdash b'tumah, and the Kohen Gadol was wearing the tzitz. And we said that tzitz is maratza ala tumah. However, tzitz maratza ala tumah, the magic power of the tzitz, is only with regard to a carbon tzibur, not to a carbon yachid. Ein omrim tzitz maratza ala tumah b'tumah sakohen b'carbon yachid. Now, with regard to a carbon tzibur, we have a machlokus where the tumah hutra b'tzibur or dechuya b'tzibur. But with regard to a carbon yachid, everybody agrees that the tzitz is not maratza. Mishum shedin ritzu tzitz nilmad min akra. The pasuk says at the end of Shmos, "V'ayal meitzach Aaron v'nasa Aaron es havona kadoshim," and the Gemara darshins in two places in Masechet Turim, Masechet Mizbachim, Avon Kodshim, v'lo Avon Makdishim. What does that mean? We're differentiating between the Kodshim, the Zevach, and the Makdishim, the Kohen who's doing the Avod. Ainu, She'eno Nosei, the power of the tzitz to be Nosei is limited to Avon HaKadoshim, which means the carbon itself contracted tumah. Ach eno nosei es avon tumas hakohanim. As far as the kohanim is concerned, there's no ritzui tzitz. So the kohen was tamei. The kohen gadol has his tzitz, and there's no ritzui. The carbon remains tamei and possible. So wherein lies the distinction between a carbon yachid and a carbon tzibur? For the sake of the tzibur, if the kohen was tamei, tzitz is maratza. But for the sake of the yachid, tzitz is only maratza on tumas kadoshim, but not on the makdishim. So we're not saying that tzitz is meaningless and impotent with regard to a carbon yachid. That far we're not going. We're saying that the tzitz is impotent, it's not powerful enough if the kohen was tamei and the carbon was a carbon yachid. If on the other hand, the carbon is a carbon tzibur, even if the kohen was tamei, or if the carbon is a carbon tzibur and the carbon itself is tamei, then there's ritzui tzitz. Now, with regard to carbon tzibur, the Torah says at the end of Bamidbar, Tishmeru lakriv li b'moado. That means that when it's the time that generates a chiyuv carbon tzibur, we're going to bring the carbon. Tishmeru, be very careful about it. And the Gemara darshans from this pasuk in the Masechta Pesachim that b'moado afilu b'tumah, which means that in the case of a carbon sibur, we bring the carbon even b'tumah. Now, whether that requires ritzui tzitz or not, he says, Prate dinim shonim yesh bazeh, there are very different dinim. So let's now study, for a few minutes, we don't have that much time, the status of a carbon sibur in a case where the Kohen was tamei, the Kohen over. Now, what kind of tumah are we dealing with? The Kohen contracted tumas mes. And we said that tumas mes has its own set of dinim within the matrix of a Kohen tamei. Here, the Kohen ha'oved had contracted tumas mes, and the carbon is a carbon sibur. We've got two pluses over here. Number one, the tumah is a lower level tumah, it's tumas mes. And number two, the carbon is a high powered carbon. It is a carbon sibur. In such a case, the carbon is kosher. Now we have to add 2 points. Point number one is that it's not just a carbon sibur, but it's a carbon sibur that has a zman kavua, a set period of time. It's time sensitive. For example, tmidim umusafir, or a carbon pesach. However, we have something called a par helim davar shel tzibur. That's not zman kavua. The par can be brought whenever it's brought. A carbon chagiga, l'chora, should be called zmano kavua. In the footnote, he says that it's not considered a zman kavua. Okay, for that we'd have to see the Lechem Mishnah and figure out why. So basically, the status of a carbon sibur, she'ein lo zman kavua, like par helim davar shel tzibur, is equal to that of a carbon yach. When we have a ribui from the pasuk, Tishmeru la'akriv liba mo'ado, and we talk about a carbon sibur shezmano kavua like tmidim musafim, that ribui is going to teach me that you could bring a carbon sibur shekavua lo zman b'tumah, but now we're focused on the case of tumas mes. The Kohen contracted tumas mes, and he's kosher to do the avoda of a carbon sibur shekavua lo zman. But now we get to a second question. How do we understand this leniency that even though the Kohen contracted tumas mes for the sake of a carbon sibur that has time urgency, we're going to allow him to bring a carbon? Nechluku b'zeh moroim im tumah hutra b'tzibur o dechuya b'tzibur. Ula'alacha tumah dechuya hi b'tzibur. Now, what's the nafkamina between tumah hutra b'tzibur? It's an absolute heter, and the Torah allows it, or tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Dechuya means that if we can find another Kohen within that time allotment, because again, the carbon has to be brought immediately, and it's going to be very difficult to rein in another Kohen, like Ayes Od Kohen, who's tar, but we have to do so. We have to make an effort to try to bring this carbon b'tara. That's called Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur. Tumah Hutra B'tzibur means that the Torah allows it. We don't have to be more religious than the Torah. We don't have to bend over backwards in order to find a Kohen tar when the Torah says that even though the Kohen contracted tumas mes, he went into an oil shel mes, he's allowed to do the avoda, and it's a korban tzibur shezmanu kavua hutra b'tzibur. La halacha, he says, we paskin dechuya b'tzibur. And in Mirz Hashem, on Yom Rishon, we'll get a little bit more into this.